Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. I've had a lot of questions I've had some questions about my mother, and people have told me they'd like to hear a little bit more about her years in the service during World War II. And I'll be more than happy to tell you about that. Don't have a lot of pictures with me here. I have them online, but they're hard to show you that way. But here's a picture of my mother in uniform. She's a first lieutenant right there, I believe. And that's my dad, actually. This is, I'm sure, after they got married, or just about the time they got married. But anyway, that they didn't get married until 1945, July 5th, as a matter of fact, of 1945. It would have been 75 years on Sunday since they got married. Well, anyway, my mother had an older brother, which I've mentioned before. His name was James. Now, James was quite a bit older, and he had probably a good 10 years, maybe 11. And he'd graduated from West Point in the late 20s, and he'd gotten out. And during the Depression, he went to work for a national trucking company. And he was called up in 1939, 1940, because China was an ally of the United States. Even though we weren't in the war yet, we were trying to support them. And they were now blockaded by Japan. They were already at war with Japan. They were blockaded by sea by Japan. And their main way of getting supplies in was over the Burma Road. So they requested help in the form of someone with military and trucking experience, transportation experience. And having run down their list, my uncle got activated. He was vice president of a national trucking company called Moran Trucking at that time. So he was able to come on leave. I think I've told you his story before. He ended up going to Washington. He was actually briefed at the White House, and before heading over to China, where he was attached as a non-combatant military advisor to the staff of Chiang Kai-shek, who was then one of the leaders of China. He came home. And that's where my mom comes in. My mother had graduated from nursing school, I think about 1938. She got a job working as a public health nurse. And she was working as a public health nurse, making the whopping amount of $40-something a week, $40-something a month. It's a lot of money back then. So everybody thought. Well, her brother James came and talked, and they had time to visit, and he told her, Nina, there's going to be a war, and I'm going back. It's coming. That war's coming, and everybody is going to be involved. And that's why I'm going to be on the staff, going to China now. Said by the time this war's over, I'll be a general. Unfortunately, that didn't happen because he was killed about 8 months later. No, about a year later, 2 years. Anyway, about 4 months after Pearl Harbor, his staff car was strafed. But that's what he said. He's, all goes well. By the end of this, I'll come out a general. There's going to be a lot of action. Everybody's going to be involved. Why don't you think about joining the serving as a nurse in the Army? So Mom did think about it. And what Mom did was, at that time, the Army Nurse Corps had not yet been founded, but there was already talk of forming an Army Nurse Corps, and it was going to be taken from the, right now what happened was the Red Cross provided nurses who were attached to the Army, but not part of the Army. But when the Nurse Corps got formed, there was already talk of forming it. They were going to use that, they were going to absorb all those people in. So Mom joined the Army Nurse Corps, well, the Red Cross, and was attached to the Army. And sure enough, she was indeed one of the initial founding, I suppose, core of the founding members of the Army Nurse Corps. And that gave her a little bit more seniority, and she was quite pleased about that. Well, she did get activated after she was already serving, and she was already serving in the military. She was stationed in Louisiana at Fort Polk, Louisiana, and Camp Claiborne, I believe, in central Louisiana. And that's where she was. And she'd been there probably, a good about not quite a year when Pearl Harbor happened. And when Pearl Harbor happened, of course, everything changed. And there was soon, they organized the Louisiana maneuvers. And if you haven't heard of the Louisiana maneuvers, it was held that spring, and it was the largest military maneuvers that the United States had ever been involved in. And unfortunately, it rained. And I remember watching, watching the movie Patton with my parents. And when George Patton makes that initial speech, he comes up and he's standing in front of the big flag. George C. Scott is playing George Patton. And he says to them, "What do you want to tell your grandchildren you did in the war? Shovel manure in Louisiana?" That my parents rolled. Of course, Patton didn't say manure, but you can just imagine what he said. But my mom and dad just broke out laughing because, of course, he was talking about all the mud and he was talking about the Louisiana maneuvers. Well, as it happened, my mom and dad met each other in the Louisiana maneuvers, and they knew each other for about 3 weeks, I believe. They were very attached, and Dad wanted to get engaged, and Mom said, "No, there's too much uncertainty in the future and all this." But they exchanged. Dad gave Mom his high school ring, and Mom gave Dad a gold cross with her name on it that had been given to her when she graduated high school by her godmother. And they continued to write throughout the war, but they each got sent off in different directions. Well, Dad got sent off to the Aleutian Islands, and which, by the way, the guy when he got told, he said when he got told he was going to the Aleutian Islands, his commanding officer had him in the briefing room and said, "Gentlemen, you're going to be sent to the Aleutian Islands. We're going to the Aleutians. And fellas, I think you're going to love it because there's a woman behind every tree." Well, it wasn't till he got there that he found out that that's all frozen tundra and there wasn't a tree for 500 miles. But that's the Army for you. Anyway, back to Mom. We're talking about her. So Mom went to New York and she got on a boat and she was being shipped out and she really wanted to go to Europe. She was so excited. It was March 1st, 1940. I don't know what it was. It had to be, yes, it was March 1st, 1942. And she was standing there because I was just reading some of her letters and preparing to talk about this, and she mentions the date. And she was sitting. She was on the ship, and she was watching all the soldiers be loaded on the troop ship she was on. And they sailed out of New York City, and she was so excited and pretty, and just sure she was headed over for England, and she'd see Europe. And then the boat turned south, and she thought, well, maybe we just turned south because of the to avoid U-boats or something, but it kept going south, south, south. And then she realized all her hopes of going to Europe, that wasn't going to happen, not this time anyway. It turns out that later on, my dad, who was activated during the Korean conflict, they were sent to Germany. So Mom did get to Europe. That was a good thing. But anyway, they went south and they went through the Panama Canal. And Mom said this was a very long trip. Well, then they hit the Pacific. They had storms like you wouldn't believe, she said, and the sea was rough, and everybody got seasick. And she was so proud of herself at first because she didn't get seasick. But then, being the only nurse on the troop, one of the few nurses on the troop ship that didn't get seasick, it meant she was taking care of everybody else. She said she was so tired of taking care of people who were throwing up. It was just awful. And finally, when everybody else is getting better, she gets seasick. And then she said, and everybody else has already been through it, so their opinion was, get over it, it's just seasickness, we all live through it. They immediately forgot how miserable it was, Mother said. Well, that was her opinion. She was sent to Australia and New Guinea, and she had several different places where she was posted. I don't know all of the ones, but I do know, she said, it would be, in lots of places, it was about one woman to maybe 1,000 men, and so there was quite an active social life. She talked more about that really than everything else, but in reading her letters, I see that a lot of the time the hospital was simply a tent city, much like you would see on MASH. Well, she had told me that. I know that they had their problems with the bugs and the insects, but in New Guinea and Australia, in New Guinea, and particularly in New Guinea, she said she had to make sure the mosquito netting was covering each and every one of her patients. She had to, they put coffee cans, and they had different cans that they would put the foot of every cot in, because then they would fill it up with kerosene. And that was in order to keep the bugs off the soldiers. They had problems, she said, because they had to fight all the other kinds of bugs that they had. Not only that, but the varmints, and they had to keep the rats out, and they had to just deal with so many things. I was reading one of her letters today, and she said she was, in that particular letter, she was telling her mother she was on wound duty, and she said all these people had jungle rot on their feet, which is basically problems with their feet. Mom got malaria, dengue fever, and dysentery while she was overseas. And life was tough. She said she can remember I know she was on bandage, she was bandage nurse, like a supply nurse, and it was her job to go to she had a Jeep assigned to her when she was in New Guinea, which she was very proud of. I remember when I asked her one time if she had a driver, she said, no, indeed, I drove my own Jeep. And she was real proud about it. But she said she could remember having to jump out of the Jeep and jump into the ditch because they were being strafed by Japanese planes. And fortunately, she fared okay, and as far as I know, she never got wounded. No, she never got wounded, because I know neither she nor Dad ever had a Purple Heart. But she really, it was a lot going on, but she would drive all over the island, she said, and she'd make sure at all the aid stations had all the supplies they need every day. And she was on that duty for quite a while. She really didn't talk, though, about the bad things all that often. The wounds and the people who died. My mother tried to always focus on the positive. She talked about the number of guys she dated. Oh, she said she was in and out of love every week. Now, Dad, meanwhile, of course, up in the Aleutians, where there was a woman behind, there were no women because there's no trees, as I just said. Dad was writing her letters on a regular basis. She said those letters kept coming in every week. She said I was in and out of love every week, but I'd always come back to your dad. In between, I'd always come back to your dad's letters. She said it was never my other relationship, my other romances were never serious. She said, and there was always those letters from your father, and I was writing him, and things just went that way. But she did talk about some other things. I asked her if, I saw the movie South Pacific. If you remember, it's a story of a nurse and who falls in love with a planter. And I said, well, Mom, did you ever date the planters? And she said, no, indeed. I had friends who did. She said the food was delicious because you got all the fresh fruit and everything you could eat. She said, but after that, all the girls said that they were nothing but hands, and they were, and you barely got out of there with your dignity intact. So she said, nope, I didn't date the planters. I stuck to the guys, mostly the it was just officers because she wasn't allowed to fraternize with enlisted men. She said some of the nurses did, but if you did, you had no place to go because the only place most of the time you went to were the officers' clubs. You went to the Navy O Club or the Army O Club, Officers Club, but that was all there was to do. And if you were dating an enlisted man, well, you couldn't go. The enlisted men usually went to the enlisted club, but you couldn't go there because it was against the rules for them to date. So she said you had to sneak around, and it was nothing but a headache, so she never bothered with it, she told me. But I did, in reading, I did learn a couple of stories. Mom said that she had leave and she went to Sydney. And she said that she and her friend Lorraine, it's in a letter she wrote to her sister, she and her friend wrote, she says, you're going to think I've been doing some things you probably wouldn't approve of, but it's nothing but good, clean fun, she said to her sister. And she said we were in Sydney and some guys, Lorraine and I, that was her friend apparently, were running around with the two flyers we were hanging out with, that we were running around with there in Sydney while we were on our vacation, on leave. And she said, and we swiped a vegetable cart, a horse-drawn vegetable cart, and we went on a joyride. And the two guys, one of them was the pilot, the other one acted as navigator, and Lorraine and I were gunners, and we picked up the leaves of the lettuce, and we were throwing it at people all along the sidewalk. It was great fun. Of course, we got caught, and she said the man wanted his horses in a cart back, and the MPs were there, and the guys talked their way out of it, saying that this was their last leave before they go. They were given this leave special because when they get back, they're going on a one-way mission. I don't know if she thought that got them off, but I don't know if it did, because I suspect the MPs had heard that kind of line before. But what probably got them off was the fact that they had to pay them the owner of the vegetable cart for all the damages. And because they did that, I suspect that's why they were let off. But not Mom. She thinks they talked their way out of it. Who knows? Mom had the devil in her, had some devilment in her. She had a wild side. I don't know all the other things that maybe she did. She talks about in her letters, she talks about the boxes from home and how special they were. And she said that the canned food and the cosmetics, it was just so wonderful and exciting. She said that one Christmas, she wrote home, one Christmas she and her roommate had gotten enough canned goods from home they could have opened their own grocery store, but heaven forbid they weren't going to do that. Instead, they were going to eat like princesses for at least 2 months. She said they'd had enough of dehydrated food, and they were glad for anything they could get from home. Well, Mom served overseas. She had served overseas for longer than any nurses, uh, except the only ones who had served as long overseas, it turned out, by the time Mom came home in 1945, in the spring early summer, I think about June of 1945, as the war was ending, she came back home for the first time. And when she got back home, of course, everybody knew what all those hash marks on her arm meant. People paid attention to those kinds of things, and they were overseas stripes. And she was yellow and jauned and had lost weight. She had a yellow tint to her skin, she said. And she said she'd be at the officers' club, and people would see all those hash marks on her arm. And they knew, and they'd see she was a nurse. And they'd assume, because the only other nurses who had that many hash marks, overseas stripes, were the nurses who had been Japanese prisoners of war. The ones who had stayed behind in the Philippines when MacArthur, with the wounded, in order to care for the wounded, when MacArthur evacuated the Philippines, and they had been captured by the Japanese and had served and had been Japanese prisoners of war. And she said people would see all those overseas stripes, and they would think she was one of those prisoners of war. And she said, someone would come up to her and they'd say, "Was it bad?" And she said, and I would turn my head and I'd say, "I don't want to talk about it," and turn my head. And then they'd buy me drinks. I said, "Mom, you didn't." She said, "Oh, well, it made them feel good to buy me drinks." I love my mother, but she was wild when she was young. I think that's why she married my father. My father was straight as an arrow, and he was strong and steady. And I think she knew she needed that in her life for them to balance each other. Well, when the war was over, as the war was winding down, because Mom went home and had some time with her family. Of course, her brother had been killed. James had been killed in Burma early in the war. But she then had her choice of where to be posted. She decided she found out that Daddy was posted in Oakland, California. So she decided to be posted to San Francisco or somewhere nearby so they could get reacquainted. Well, they did. And 4 weeks later, they got married. Now, Mom talked about her time in the military. I know it was tough. I know there were awful things she saw, wounded and injured people. But Mom chose to focus. The memories she chose to share and the things she chose to focus on were always the positive ones. She didn't minimize the sacrifices that were made. And always on Memorial Day, on Veterans Day, and on the 4th of July, those were special days for Mom and Dad, because they not only honored those who serve, they knew so many who had served and who had given it all. I'm very fortunate to have had the parents I have. Wonderful people. And I hope, thank you for giving me this opportunity to share some of the memories of World War II, of her years in the Army Nurse Corps during World War II that my mother shared with me. Until next time, God bless you.